Mathematician, banker and public figure, Dr. Tony Tan is well known to many of us as Singapore's former Deputy Prime Minister for 10 years, from 1995 till 2005. Prior to that, he also held many ministerial portfolios in education, trade and industry, finance, health and defence. Only very recently, Dr. Tan stepped down from his positions at the Government of Singapore Investment Corporation and Singapore Press Holdings. Ladies and gentlemen, I present you Dr. Tony Tan.
Mr. Teo Seong Seng, President of the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Teh Beng Chuan, the Honorary President of the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to be invited to speak at the Distinguished Speakers Lecture Series of the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industry, SCCCI. The SCCCI has played a key role in Singapore's economic development for well over a century. SCCCI and its leadership have guided the local Chinese business community through 2 world wars, many regional upheavals, and a long march for Singapore from a third world colonial outpost to the thriving first world city that we live in today, making many valuable contributions to Singapore and the region along the way. We cannot predict the future, but we must prepare to meet challenges that could confront us. It is therefore opportune to step back and take stock of our journey so far, and to try to look forward to discuss the uncertainties that may lie ahead. And that will be the theme of my talk this morning. 2 long-term structural trends will shape the investment and the business communities, both in the medium term and also in the coming decades. First, while the developed world, in particular the United States, seems to be recovering, the recovery is fragile, and the longer-term outlook is still unusually uncertain and carries considerable global macro, financial and economic risks. The second major trend, the center of gravity of economic activity and wealth generation, will slowly but inexorably shift from the West, from the developed countries, US and Europe, to Asia. Singapore will increasingly in the coming years find itself at the heart of the largest economies in the world, China and India, as well as huge, increasingly integrated regional blocs like Indochina and Indonesia. This shift of economic and geopolitical power will create unparalleled business and investment opportunities. However, it will also generate more geopolitical, environmental, and policy risks than we have seen for a long time. All business firms and policy makers will have to consider how to organize themselves to meet both these great opportunities and also these new risks to better manage this uncertain but exciting future. I'll now talk about the recovery and structural macro risks in the developed world. The last few years have been extremely stressful for the United States and the global economy. In 2008 and 2009, just 2 years ago, the world was on the brink of a global depression, similar to what we suffered during the 1930s. Last year, however, due to the unprecedented efforts of governments and central banks led by the US Fed, the global economy stabilized and recovered firmly, led by the major emerging markets, including China and India. While growth in the United States has been slower than expected, there is hope that it may reach possibly 3 to 4% in the second half of 2011. The improving outlook for the U.S. reflects healthier household and financial sector balance sheets, as well as unprecedented fiscal and monetary stimulus, QE1, QE2, and possibly now even the QE3. However, major structural post-crisis problems remain in important developed economies. There is excess debt in the developed world, high levels of unemployment above 9% in the US, need for global rebalancing, an unfinished agenda in reforming the financial system, and uncertainty as when companies and firms will invest and hire people. Many of the structural problems that the developed world faces could be resolved to a return to above-trend nominal GDP growth. Emerging markets with their lower debt levels and younger, faster-growing populations represent a major investment opportunity. However, these excess savings countries need to allow their exchange rates to appreciate and to allow a domestic credit cycle to take hold and reduce their dependency on their traditional export destinations. Consumption and investment patterns established over the past decade are thus likely to be unsustainable going forward. Major currency moves and even new global monetary arrangements could ultimately be part of the adjustment mechanism in a multi-year shift between debtor and creditor, high growth and low growth countries. These in turn could see increased volatility of real yields and inflation expectations, as well as equity and bond returns. Policymakers, therefore, need to take markets back from a world that is presently overwhelmed by uncertainty, including policy uncertainty, to one in which normal business risks prevail. This will then encourage business investments, which in many countries like the US remain at decade-level lows. In all, global rebalancing and deleveraging is inevitable, but its path is unpredictable. Global investors and businessmen will have to adapt to and manage risks that could bring widespread damage to the global financial system and economy, as well as create opportunities. Still, notwithstanding these challenges and the issues which confront us today, we should not be overly pessimistic. There are grounds in the long term for optimism about the global economy and the corporate sector in the US, notably in the strong growth of credit to the US bank's corporate customers in almost all industries except for housing. And we should not underestimate the strengths of the US economy and the growth prospects of the major emerging economies, especially China. I'll now talk about Asia. The coming decades will see the unprecedented rise of global emerging economies and markets, and this will be led by Asia. Not only will China and India, according to economists, surpass the United States in economic size by 2030 in the case of China, 2050 in the case of India, but the so-called Growth 8 emerging countries, first the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India and China, followed by Mexico, Korea, Turkey and Indonesia. These Growth 8 economies could see an increase in their US dollar terms GDP growth, which is 4 to 5 times that of growth in the US economy, and this could take place within this decade. The potential for rapid urbanization also implies that 70% of the world's new infrastructure projects will be found in China and India alone over the next 2 decades, and this will generate an insatiable demand for construction and resources. The emerging economies will also collectively see the world's biggest consumer boom over the same period. Given such tremendous growth opportunities, the risk to businesses and investors of not participating in this growth is, in my view, as big a risk as the obvious risks of investing in emerging and frontier markets. Furthermore, progress in macro policy stabilization and policy reform in many of the major emerging economies means that for the first time in economic history, many of the emerging economies actually have better debt and fiscal fundamentals than the G3 developed economies, US, Europe, and Japan. But that said, I do not need to remind all of you, this audience, that the risks of investing and doing business in emerging economies are a very different ballgame, and at a country level, much more unpredictable than in a more institutionally stable developed countries. This implies that a far greater capability needs to be developed in understanding, anticipating, and managing developmental, political, institutional, and policy risks in emerging markets, particularly in the dominant Asian economies like China, India, Indochina, and Indonesia. One example, China's transition from a middle-income country to a high-income country will not be easy. There will be problems. There will be a need to retire old industries, find new growth sectors, rebalance incomes, stimulate domestic consumption, encourage investment in the right sectors, and attract long-term capital to deepen and liberalize captive financial markets that have lent heavily to state-owned enterprises. China also has to enforce stronger corporate governance and avoid asset bubbles and boom-bust cycles with a financial sector which is today not yet fully developed. While the old centralized state institutions in China were appropriate for encouraging investment-led growth in the early labor-intensive expansion stages, it is not clear that these institutions can successfully manage the future challenges without a significant overhaul of political, fiscal, regulatory, and legal institutions. Similarly, large and difficult structural and institutional changes, each with their own local idiosyncrasies and challenges, will need to occur in major emerging regions like India, Brazil, Indochina, and Indonesia. And in the long run, natural resource scarcity and environmental problems could become serious growth constraints that, for example, both India and China will soon have to address. Potentially disruptive policies and technologies may have to be introduced if they are to manage these problems successfully. To fully take advantage of the opportunities and to properly manage risks in emerging markets, businesses and organizations need to be sufficiently plugged into complex, major economic, political, and technological developments in the rapidly growing economies. This challenge is, I'm sure, familiar to many of you as you run your businesses. However, the scale of such an effort and its impact on business activities could soon become an issue of unprecedented importance that all of us will have to face in the coming decades. And finally, as new superpowers rise in Asia, this will inevitably lead to more competition with the US and the developed world, both geopolitically and economically. This will in turn raise the need for unprecedented international policy coordination in managing trade, capital flows, financial regulation, and managing access to natural resources and dealing with the consequences of climate change. Geopolitical risks, and unfortunately, the potential for disastrous policy missteps or mistakes are now also probably higher than at any time since the end of the Cold War. The Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industry has traditionally been one of the main players in China, Southeast Asia, and the region. As a spearhead of the local business interests in Asian-led emerging market growth, SCCCI will again have an important and historic role to play in Singapore's ongoing journey in economic development. In Chinese, the word crisis, weiqi, contains, as you all know, both the characters of risk, wei, and opportunity, ji. So there are both risks and opportunities in crisis. I have tried this morning to share how businesses and global investors looking from west to east can take advantage of the major economic trends and balance the risks and opportunities in the medium to longer term. I hope that SCCCI membership and leadership will build the capability to take full advantage of the opportunities and challenges and skillfully navigate and manage the risks that will inevitably come our way over the coming decades. My best wishes for the continued progress, prosperity, and success of the Chamber and all its members. Thank you very much.